Module 2, Referential Pragmatics. Leach 1983-11 briefly mentions the label for the area that we will discuss in this module, namely Referential Pragmatics. He defines it as the assignment of reference to referential expression in a given utterance. The notion of reference briefly popped up in the previous module. Let us explore the area through an example. Consider this statement. The Palgrave editor visited me in my office today. The Palgrave editor is who exactly? There are several such editors who work for the publisher Palgrave, and there have been many such editors. Which one are we talking about? This is a referring expression directing the reader to pick out a specific person from the context. Similarly, my office is directing the reader to pick out a particular place. Again, the reader will have to work out which office is being talked about. What of me and my? Clearly, they refer to the author of this statement, and it is up to the reader to work out who that author is. Similarly, today refers to the time period in which the author was writing, and we would need to work out when that is. All these expressions involve working out connections with context. They are referring expressions. In a very general sense, all expressions used in relation to something out there in the world, a world which includes the discourses we create, can be said to involve reference to something. Reference, broadly conceived, is a topic of special interest in semantics and philosophy. This kind of very general relation is not our focus here. We are interested in expressions such as those in our example, whose meaning will seem inadequate without the interpreter having made a connection with a specific part of a specific context, a referent. The fact that those expressions involve a referent, an entity to which they refer, means that all referring expressions presuppose the existence of an entity. We will use the term referring to denote the narrower, more dynamic, indeed pragmatic, usage of expressions that connect with context, both drawing meaning from it and shaping it. Note that referring expressions do not in themselves refer to entities. Both are used and interpreted by participants as doing so. That is what makes them pragmatic. One key issue when considering referring expression is, naturally, what a specific aspect of context the speaker is referring to. In pragmatics, there are at least three key dimensions involved in referring. Consider, for instance, the following excerpt from the film Four Weddings and a Funeral, which starts when Charles attempts to introduce himself to another guest at the wedding. Charles: How do you do? My name is Charles. Guest: Don't be ridiculous. Charles died 20 years ago. Charles: Must be a different Charles, I think. Guest: Are you telling me I don't know my own brother? Charles: No. We can identify at least three different forms of referring going on in this rather confused interaction. First, we have both Charles and the guest referring to themselves and the other through various pronouns, including I and you. These involve pointing to a specific referent in the extra-linguistic context and, most importantly, indicating how this referent relates to some point of reference. This is traditionally termed deixis. Second, there is some confusion as to whether Charles refers to a person the guest already knows or one he is getting to know at that very moment, or what we might term epistemic aspects of context. In this case, the speakers are referring to assumptions about who they think the other person has in mind. When the speaker assumes that the hearer knows the specific referent in mind, this comes under scope of definiteness, while when the speaker doesn't make such an assumption, it is a matter of indefiniteness. The crux of the guest's confusion here is the guest has his brother in mind when Charles is referred to, and consequently thinks that Charles does as well. Third, some expressions they are used to refer back to things they have said earlier. For instance, when the guest utters my own brother, he is referring back to his previous reference to Charles who died 20 years ago. Instances where speakers are referring back to what has been earlier referred to in previous talk, or what might be termed linguistic aspects of context or context, comes under the scope of anaphora. In this module, we will be explaining in more detail the pragmatics of these three forms of referring. Supplying a list of English referring expressions is not straightforward. However, as debates rage over where to draw the line with respect to what is referring and what is not, let us first briefly consider the extremes. All scholars would agree that verbs and prepositions are not referring expressions. Consider our example 2.1 above. The verb visited and the preposition in were the only items we did not claim to be referring expressions. To understand them, you do not need to pick out a specific visit or a specific spatial relation with respect to the office. The other extreme is more controversial. Many, if not all, scholars would agree that the demonstrative this is a referring expression of some kind. But there are other possible candidates for referring expressions too. Table 2.1 lists English referring expressions that are thought to be so by many scholars. In broad terms, the categories of Table 2.1 are ordered from those whose meaning is more descriptive, more encoded in the abstract sense of the expression, to those whose meaning is more contextual, more dependent on a relationship with a specific contextual aspect. The former is more semantic and the latter more pragmatic. The book, a definite expression, has some descriptive meaning in the abstract, as the noun book denotes the concept of a book, although we do not know which particular book is being referred to. This, a deictic expression, has very little descriptive meaning in the abstract, although we may suppose that it concerns something relatively close in some way to the speaking voice. The organization of this module is based on this table. First, we attend to the extremes of the table, definite expressions followed by deictic expressions, and then anaphoric expressions in the middle. In the final section, we take a more interactional view of how referring expressions are used and understood. Definite expressions. Definite expressions encode some semantic meaning in their nominal elements. For example, as mentioned above, book in the definite expression, the book relates to whatever mental representation you have for the concept of a book. Moreover, Fredge 1892 and 1952 noted that a definite expression not only denotes something but also implies that it exists. Russell 1905, however, argued that the key issue with expressions such as the book is not just that they imply existence, but that generally they indicate uniqueness. For Russell, definite expressions do not refer directly to something. It is simply a matter of finding a true match between the semantic descriptive content of the expression and any candidates for a match in the world. Others, such as Strawson 1950, argue from a more pragmatic perspective that it all depends on the use of the expression in context. For example, the semantics of the book in a decontextualized sentence such as pass the book may signal that a unique book is involved, but you are unlikely to know exactly which book is being referred to. In contrast, if somebody arrived in the room where you are right now and said the same to you, you may be led into thinking not only that a unique book is involved, but also that they refer to the very book you are now reading. And if they arrive when you were reading in bed, you might think that they refer to your bedtime novel. A starting point is to say that definite expressions are primarily used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific context which is assumed to be shared by the interlocutors. There are various ways in which languages can signal definiteness. The paradigm method in English is the definite article the most frequent word in written and spoken English. Like other noun phrase determiners, such as possessive determiner pronouns, demonstrative, or S genitives, definite articles determine the definiteness of the noun phrase. Compare the sentences in 2.3. Letter A. The book you're reading is great. Letter B. A book you're reading is great. You are likely to interpret A as referring to the book you are currently reading, but with B, it could be about any book you are currently reading. B contains the indefinite article A, contrasting with the definite article the. Apart from noun phrases with determiners, pronouns can express definite in English, as can proper nouns, a topic we will discuss below. Reflection, the development of the in English. The earliest stages of English had no definite article, nor did it have a contrasting indefinite article. Speakers and writers in Old English deployed the demonstrative form se, from which the seems to have developed for some of the functions undertaken by today's the. Se is the nominative masculine form of the demonstrative and may not ring any present-day demonstrative bells, but the nominative and accusative neuter form is poet. The first letter of this word represents the sound later represented by th, from which, as is plain to see, is derived the present-day demonstrative that. Let us look at the example. As one can see from the present-day translation, there are 2 points where the Old English demonstrative can be rendered by either present-day, the or that. Both signal definiteness, that is, they invite participants to identify a particular entity, for example, a particular archbishop, a particular year. Today, the difference between the and that in this context is that, unlike the, is used to focus the target's attention on something. But, in Old English, this use is not so clear. Incidentally, the other instance of that in that heavenly life is not the same. In this case, it involves a deictic contrast with the previous demonstrative this, such that the referent moved from the relatively close state of this life to the relatively far away state of that heavenly life. We will discuss deictic matters more fully in section 2.3, but the point to note here is that the Old English demonstrative se, along with its various forms, was deployed in a range of functions, including whose, for which we would regularly use the word the today. Over time, then, a demonstrative form has developed into the definite article the English language has today. Note, with particular reference to Table 2.1, it has moved from the relatively contextual, extra-linguistic category of deictic expressions to the relatively abstract, linguistic category of definite expressions, in other words, from more pragmatic to less. English is not alone in the way its definite article developed. Definite articles in Romance languages, such as le, il, el, lo, la, have developed from the Latin demonstrative although there are complexities for specific dialects of these languages. Although the categories in Table 2.1 do not always represent continuous links in a chain. If a particular item develops function outside its initial category, they are usually functions that belong to a less contextually determined category. They rely less on a specific context for a particular meaning and instead have the same meaning for a range of contexts, that is, they are more abstract. It is a matter of controversy as to whether this is true of all languages. See Frasonier 1996 for some counter-evidence. Thus, not only are definite expressions often developed from deictic expressions, but anaphoric expressions are often developed from deictic expressions, and proper nouns sometimes develop into common nouns. Hence, eponymic nouns such as Wellingtons, cardigan, sandwich, sadism, and atlas. This movement is consistent with what has, in historical linguistics, been referred to as grammaticalization. As a lexical construction enters and continues along a grammaticalization pathway, it undergoes successive changes in meaning, broadly interpretable as representing an unidirectional movement away from its original or concrete reference and toward increasingly general and abstract reference. Paglico's statement makes the connection with a movement away from meanings anchored in a concrete context towards the abstract. Reflection. Marking definiteness. Many European languages are like English in having a separate word or words, marking definiteness. Other languages, such as the Scandinavian languages, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic, and the Semitic languages Hebrew, Arabic, and Kurdish, use an affix rather than a separate word. Yet, other languages such as Latvian, Xhosa, and Indonesian regularly deploy a demonstrative for this purpose. English can also use a demonstrative to sign definiteness, but it is not regularly deployed just to mark definiteness in the way that "the" is. Still, other languages such as Chinese, Japanese, and Russian, and many other Slavic languages use none of these resources to mark definiteness. This is why, of course, a distinctive feature of English spoken by speakers of these languages is the lack of the definite article. Indeed, some research on marking definiteness in English in interactions where all the participants are non-native speakers has suggested that dropping the definite article in some instances where it would be required in standard forms of English, and inserting it where it would not normally be grammatically required, is a feature of English as a lingua franca. It is not the case that any one form, such as the examples of definite expressions in Table 2.1, will always have a referring function, which incidentally is partly why these are pragmatic, not semantic issues. Consider this sentence. Bus and train are much the same price at the moment, though it's quicker to take the bus. This is not likely to be referring to a particular bus, but to any vehicle with the attributes of a bus. It is a non-referential descriptive usage of a definite expression as opposed to a referential usage. Here, we are talking about buses as opposed to any other mode of transport. The definite expression invites the interpreter to work out the more general category, of which this is a specific subcategory, buses. So, in this case, the definite expression is not used to signal an act of identification but a distinction between the specific and the general. Additionally, we might note here that indefinite expressions can also refer. Consider this sentence. Suddenly, a small single-decker bus appeared at a corner not far away. Clearly, we are referring to a particular identifiable bus in a particular context, despite the fact that an indefinite article is used. Compare this with a non-referring usage of an indefinite expression such as too shy to board a bus. As a solitary student in London, he walked miles around the streets, sharpening his observation. In section 2.5, we will examine the functions of referring expressions, including definite expressions, more closely. We use proper nouns to invite hearers to identify the unique individual or set of individuals we are talking about. Proper nouns inherently identify a unique individual or set of individuals. They have definiteness built in and thus appear as a subcategory of definite expressions in Table 2.1. This fact may partly explain why, in English, one would not normally put a definite article before a proper noun. However, this is not a full explanation because some other languages do allow a definite article before a proper noun. For example, in some dialects of Italian, definite articles are systematically used before personal names, and in Italian generally, they are used before names of countries. This is not a bizarre as it may seem to the native English speaker. A century ago, Russell 1910-1911 argued that proper nouns are not just empty shells used to refer to a particular individual, but are associated with a descriptive content which determines what they refer to, somewhat like definite common noun phrases such as the book. Reflection, proper nouns and meaning. Whether one agrees that proper nouns work through associated descriptive content or not, there is no doubt that proper nouns are not the purest or referring expressions. They are not devoid of all abstract semantic meaning. They have rich connotations, with the line between connotative and denotative sense being fuzzy. Kassoff 1993. Having reviewed a vast quantity of research, most of it North American, and conducted studies of his own, concludes that both first names and surnames differ in attractiveness and connote impressions of the name bearer's age, intellectual competence, race, ethnicity, social class, and other attributes. It is not difficult to understand how these different associations have developed at different times. Different names have been fashionable, and different social groups have preferred particular names. For example, the names Kevin and Tracy, though popular in the mid-80s, have experienced rapid decline, presumably because they became strongly associated with the young, moneyed working-class people of late Thatcherite Britain. While some scholars may argue with some reason against the descriptive content view, saying that proper nouns directly refer without any mediating semantic content. Proper nouns clearly do have connotations that assist not only in the assignment of reference in context but also in the overall interpretation. For example, a tutor writing a summon on elusive student may sign the communication Jonathan Culpeper as opposed to Jonathan. in order to crank up the level of formality and thus strengthen the request order. The general and important point here that each proper noun has its own semantic coloring which feeds into interpretive processes in interaction is true of all referring expressions. Also, it is important to note that no one proper noun form is necessarily performing a referring function all the time. For example, Mick may be thought of as a proper noun, but it is a common noun in this sentence. When he first came in, I offered him a drink out of courtesy, and I think he thought I was taking the Mick out of his drinking in the past. Indeed, proper nouns evolving into common nouns is a regular method of word formation. Deixis. We now turn to deixis, the category of the bottom of Table 2.1. We will discuss anaphora in the section following this one. Deixis relies heavily, though not completely, on the extralinguistic context to supply the referent, and not semantic elements within the deictic expression itself. It may be helpful to note here that the word deictic is borrowed from the Greek deiktikos, meaning able to show, showing directly. Deixis involves connections between a reference point and aspects of the situation in which the utterance takes place. Deictic expressions invite participants to work out particular connections. When somebody telephones another and says, "It's me," they invite the interlocutor to work out, on the basis of oral characteristics, that "me" refers to the speaker. Occasionally, of course, the speaker's assumptions that the interlocutor can work out who is speaking turn out to be wrong, and the interlocutor has to ask explicitly who it is. Consider another example, this time provided by Charles Fillmore, 1997-60. The worst possible case I can imagine for a totally unanchored occasion sentence is that of finding a float in the ocean, a bottle containing a note which reads, "Meet me here at noon tomorrow with a stick about this big." Who is me? Where is here? When is tomorrow? And how big is this? Examples such as this neatly illustrate how one's understanding depends on making connections between a reference point, that is, a deictic center of anchorage point, from which the speaker positions their discourse in a particular context. If we cannot make these connections, we end up with very limited understanding. The deictic center is generally the "I hear now" of the speaker, or more accurately, of the speaking voice in the particular situation. The speaking voice could be that of, for example, an individual, a group of people, or a character in a book. Deictic expressions signal a perspective relative to a particular deictic center. To take the Mickey is a colloquial idiomatic expression in British English meaning to make fun of somebody. Your "you" is my "I", your "here" is my "there", etc. In conversation, the deictic center obviously flips back and forth according to who is speaking. The deictic center can also be projected. If somebody rings you up and invites you over for some coffee, you may reply, "I'll come over in a few minutes." Come is a deictic verb, as it suggests that movement of something in the context towards the deictic center. In this case, the deictic center is not that of the speaker but that of the addressee. This is the case of deictic projection. The speaker projects the deictic center onto the addressee and speaks from the point of view of the addressee. A key point about deictic expressions is that they interface with grammatical systems. This feature is brought out in Levenson's 1983-54 definition of deixis. Deixis concerns the ways in which languages encode or grammaticalize features of the context of utterance or a speech event, and thus also concerns ways in which the interpretation of utterances depends on the analysis of the context of utterance. Expressions such as I, me, and my are most clearly part of grammatical systems. Table 2.2 displays the types of deixis traditionally identified and their associated expressions. Of course, deictic expressions can be used non-deictically. Consider the underlined items in these sentences. Read the small print "U" is underlined. Never know what you may find. Now, there is another way of advertising, and with Harrogate not coming off, I might say I'm quite keen on this. Expressions such as I, me, and my are most clearly part of grammatical systems. Here, you is a generic usage, not referring to anyone in particular. There does not pick out a particular location, but is a case of existential there. That is to say, a kind of dummy subject which occurs in clauses about the existence of or occurrence of something. Finally, I, me, and my do not refer to the speaker, as they are metalinguistic mentions of the pronoun rather than uses of them. As Fillmore 1997 points out, even demonstratives, a category that seems to be the purest category of deictic items, in fact, have both deictic and non-deictic usages. Gestural usages such as this boot are supported by a gesture like pointing. They are deictic. Symbolic usages, in contrast, rely on general spatiotemporal knowledge. They could be accompanied by a gesture, but would still be understood without. For example, in this newspaper headline, "Technology, let's make this country the best," it will be obvious to most UK-based Guardian readers that this country refers to the UK without gestures. The converse is also true. Typically, non-deictic expressions can be used deictically. For example, he or she would not normally be discussed as deictic expressions, as they are typically anaphoric, referring back to something mentioned previously in the discourse rather than connecting with the extra-linguistic context. But it is not too difficult to imagine a context in which they clearly have a deictic referring function. Consider a reconstructed conversation during which a parent brings a crying baby into the room and an interlocutor says, "So, he's the one making all the noise." We should also keep in mind the fact that items within categories, such as those of Table 2.1, vary with respect to the degree to which they are semantically descriptive and contextually pragmatic. For example, here indicates the speaker's special deictic center, but "come" also encodes the meaning of locomotions towards it. Let us elaborate on the particular categories of Table 2.2. Personal, as a deictic category, refers to the identification of three discourse roles in the speaking situation: the speaker, the first person; the hearer, the second person; and the party being talked about, the third person. Person is a hugely important grammatical category. First, second, and or third person is marked or implicit in all utterances. An indication of its importance in English is in the fact that the second most frequent word in spoken English is I, and the third is you. Personal deixis invites participants to identify the relevant discourse rules in the context. Person markers are not devoid of encoded meaning. In fact, they rarely encode person alone, but also have other grammatical distinctions. In English, these are number, gender, and case. Note here that deictic person markers are typically the first and second persons, not the third. Third-person forms are generally anaphoric, that is, not extra-linguistic but referring back to the linguistic context of the utterance, though, as illustrated in the previous paragraph, third-person forms can be used deictically. Reflection: Person markers in the history of English. English used to have a somewhat different system of grammaticalized expressions available for deictic purposes. Regarding personal pronouns, one notable difference concerned number. While today we can use most personal pronouns to distinguish number insofar as the referent is singular or plural. In Old English, there were also the remnants of the dual forms of the first and second person pronouns. Thus, with meant we both and yet meant you both. This, of course, would also have implications for what at the time counted as plural in this grammatical system. It would have been more than two, whereas today it is more than one. However, the area of radical change concerns the second person pronouns. Elizabethan English, for example, offered a choice between two sets of pronominal forms for the second person. The forms ye, you, your, yours, and yourself, and the forms thou, thee, thy, thine, and thyself, the thou forms. In Old English, you generally use the first set for a plural referent and the second for a singular. But by Middle English, the variant chosen could have significant social implications. These items had taken on a stronger social deictic role, rather than just personal. The usage of these sets is a matter of great controversy. Brown and Hillman 1960 predicted that high-status social equals used you forms to each other. Low-status social equals used thou forms to each other. High-status individuals used thou forms to lower status, and low-status individuals used you forms to higher status. These predictions fit the usage of Middle English reasonably well. One can see a certain similarity in the way you forms and thou forms were used in this period of English with the way, for example, du and vos are used in today's French or du and sei in German. However, these predictions become more and more unreliable as we move towards the 17th century. The meanings of any particular usage had increasingly to be inferred from the specifics of context. Take this brief extract from the Merry Tales of Skelton, 1567 as an example. In this tale, Skelton, a parson, tries to persuade a cobbler to go to war. Neither you be a tall man, and in the king's wars you must bear a standard. Generally, in this tale, Skelton uses thou to the cobbler. This fits the theory which predicts a high-status participant using thou to a lower-status participant. But here, despite the difference in social status, Skelton uses you to the cobbler. Why he does so is a pragmatic issue, not simply a matter of correlating usage and status. Here, Skelton is trying to be persuasive, using you lends a note of respect. Ultimately, the thou forms have become obsolete, except in some areas of Yorkshire and Lancashire. The fact that English second-person pronouns have now been reduced to a single set of forms based on you without any encoded meanings regarding number or social position, marks English out as distinct from many languages, especially European. By the way of a postscript, it is worth noting that some dialects of English have relatively recently developed the plural form use. Liverpool English is a case in point, and this expression has been identified as characteristic of at least some Australian and Irish speakers of English. Hove, 1985. In some dialects of American English, particularly in the South and Texan regions of the U.S., other second-person plural forms such as you all and you-ons can be found. In Table 2.2, we have split personal dixes into two subcategories, one pertaining to participant marking and the other pertaining to social relationship marking. The latter subcategory is often referred to as social dixies. There is absolutely no hard and fast distinction between these two subcategories. The history of you forms and though forms in English is a case in point. Today, English relies largely on vocatives expressions usually used to address people, to mark social relationships, especially in the form of noun phrases. Note, of course, the overlap here with the discussion of proper nouns in section 2.3. However, remember that we are focusing on deictic uses of proper nouns. A summary of social deictic expressions in present-day British English with very brief indications regarding context of usage and the proportion of uses accounted for by each type is as follows. Endearments, for example, my darling, love, sweetie. Typical address between close female family members, sexual partners, and favorite people. Family, kinship terms. Daddy, mommy, ma, pa, grandma, granny, grandpa, granddad. Typical address to family members of an older generation. Familiarizers. Typical address between males signaling solidarity. First names, a typical address between friends and family members, as well as other even casual acquaintances. B. A subgroup of first names is familiarized first names, shortened first names, and or with the pet suffix. Title and surname typically means of marking a more distant and respectful relationship. Honorifics, relatively rare in English. They may occur in situations such as formal service encounters, where there is a markedly asymmetrical relationship between speakers. Others see below. Although relatively rare, there is a wide range of other forms limited only by one's creativity. Biber et al. 1999 provides some illustrations from the Longman Corpus of English. Hello, lazy. Oh, make your bloody mind up, boy. Come on, you Reds. Come on, you Reds. Come on, you Reds. Those of you who want to bring your pets along, please sit in the back of the spaceship. As might have been observed from the above summary, social deictic expressions mark not only social relationships but also, amongst other factors, settings, and in particular their degree of formality. A good example of social dixies restricted to a particular setting is the use of surnames only in more traditional schools, notably British public schools, not just by teachers to pupils but also, to an extent, between pupils themselves. Reflection. Social dixies across languages. Person marking varies hugely from language to language. Consider, for example, that Fijian is said to have 135 person forms, whereas Madrase, an Austronesian language, has only 2, Swirská 2004. One of the reasons for this is that person marking interacts with the socio-cultural context of the particular language. As Mohlsler and Haring, 1990-207, quoted in Swiderska 2004, comment, pronominal grammar provides a window to the relationship between themselves and the outside world. Obviously, this fact is most salient with respect to social dixes. Non-singular second person marking when addressing a single person is often a way of signaling social distance, deference, particularly in the context of an age differential, or formality, as was the case, at least to some extent, with the U forms in earlier periods of English, and is still the case in many European languages. Non-singular person marking is also used for single reference in many other languages, but not necessarily for the same social reasons. Some languages achieve such social functions with the use of the third person. For example, in Italian, one uses the third person feminine singular lei, and in German, the third person plural se. Such person marking phenomena are part of linguistic honorifics, conventional system of forms that honor a participant in some way. Such forms include not only person markings, but also forms of address, various affixes, clitics and particles, and choice of vocabulary. Present-day English does not have a rich honorific system, being now largely confined to forms of address, as noted above. Other languages, particularly those of East and Southeast Asia, have remarkably rich systems. In Thai, there are said to be 27 forms used for the first person, 22 for the second, and 8 for the third. These are used according to, amongst other things, social status, intimacy, age, sex, and kinship, and to reflect difference or assertiveness. Person markers, as we have seen for all referring expressions in this module, are not always used in such a way that their encoded meaning matches their usage. Mismatches are often deployed for the purpose of generating local social meanings. Consider, for example, the range of possible reference for the English form. Some of these mismatches have become well established. A is, of course, the royal we, pragmatically I, a more recent example of which are the words of Margaret Thatcher upon discovering that she had become a grandmother in 1989. We have become a grandmother. The royal we might be said to be a case of self-deference. The speaker is the honorific focus. B is a typical usage of the exclusive we, pragmatically not I, where the avoidance of the pronoun you in requests or commands lends a veneer of politeness. A full discussion of we and other English pronouns. As can be seen from Table 2.2, a category of deictic expressions can express special relations. As far as English is concerned, special deixis typically expresses a relationship relating to distance between the deictic center of the speaker and a referent. English has a proximal distal contrast, as might be illustrated by items such as here, there, and this, that. However, usage of these items, particularly the final set of demonstratives, is not always restricted to physical spatial relations. In the extract from Shakespeare below, John and Gaunt laments the fact that England is not what it was. England has been sold out by Richard II, the current king, in pursuit of his own glory. The contrast is between proximal this England, near in time, and the distal that England, further away in time. We might also briefly note that sometimes the issue is one of focusing the target's attention. Thus, while here she is might well convey the fact that somebody has arrived in the vicinity, it also draws attention to the fact and dot in I'd like dot 1 said of several items all the same distance from the speaker, focuses the target's attention on a particular item. Reflection, spatial deixis and comparisons with today's English. Today, English deictic spatial expressions are part of a two-term system. However, English used to have a three-term system. In addition to the adverbs here and there, English had the expression yonder, and in addition to the demonstratives this and that, it had the expression you. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer writes around 1386, "Whose is that fair child that standeth yonder?" These items were used for entities at some distance from the deictic center but still within sight. They are a kind of medial stage between proximal and distal. Modern Spanish is an example of a language with a three-term system based on similar lines. Other languages differ from English with respect to the number of terms used and the kind of relationship captured. Modern German is a case in point. While modern spoken German has an adverb contrast with here and dort there, it does not have a demonstrative contrast of the type achieved in English by this and that. Demonstratives occurring with nouns are comprised of desire and stressed there, die, thus. The unstressed latter items are usually considered definite articles. However, as Teasel 2008 points out, what makes all these items demonstrative-like rather than definite article-like is their pragmatic function. Like distance-marked demonstratives, these expressions are commonly used to focus the hearer's attention on entities in the surrounding situation, which is not what speakers usually do with definite markers. Readers will note some similarity here with Old English, as discussed above. Some languages mark even more degrees of distance. Malagasy apparently uses 7 demonstrative adverbs and 6 demonstrative pronouns to mark increasing degrees of distance from the speaker. Anderson and Keenan, 1985. English has a special deictic system based on degrees of distance between the speaker as deictic center and the referent. Some languages have a different kind of relationship as their basis, one that is less egocentric and not based on degrees of distance. Japanese is an example of the language that factors in nearness, or not, of the referent to the speaker, the hearer and the speaker and hearer. Thus, it has near the speaker, near the hearer, and away from the speaker and hearer. If one remembers the notion of deictic projection as introduced above, one can see how this might work. For example, with sono, the speaker projects the deictic center onto the hearer. Such deictic systems have been described as person-based systems as opposed to distance-based systems. Anderson and Keenan, 1985. Finally, we briefly note here that some Austronesian languages do not take any speech participants as deictic centers but orientate towards absolute geographical location points such as seaward versus landward, or even simply coordinates like north, south, east, and west. The final category in Table 2.2, temporal deixis, concerns expressions which can convey relations over time. As far as English is concerned, they typically express a relationship between a deictic center and the time of the speaker's utterance. Now refers to a span of time encompassing the speaker's utterance. The use of the present tense as opposed to the past can mark the speaker's current time of speaking. The auxiliary verbs such as will, shall, going to, etc. can mark some point in the future. Tomorrow, next week, yesterday, ago, etc. indicate a span of time in relation to the speaker's current utterance. Deictic expressions, as we have seen, are usually taken as referring to entities in the extra-linguistic world. Some scholars have also distinguished discourse or textual deixis, which involves making a connection with a segment of discourse. Consider this: reconstructed words said by a tutor at the end of a lecture in the UK. That's the end, but don't rush off just yet. As I said at the beginning, I have some announcements. Here they are. Then displays and reads announcements on a PowerPoint slide. That points back to the preceding discourse. Here points to upcoming discourse. Given that we are now dealing with textual links, this category of deixis is not so pure. It also overlaps with the notion of anaphora, which we will discuss in the following section, though it is in principle distinguishable on some counts, as we will note. Anaphora. Anaphoric expressions refer to a previously expressed textual unit or meaning, the so-called antecedent. Anaphora in the context of linguistics is generally understood to refer to a relation between two linguistic elements, wherein the interpretation of one, called an anaphor, is in some way determined by the interpretation of the other, called an antecedent. It may be helpful to know that the term anaphora is derived from the Greek word meaning carrying back. Here is an example. Should Michael peel the potatoes on the board? Yes, he can do them there. The anaphoric expressions in bis utterance and their antecedents are as follows: he, Michael, do peel them, the potatoes, and there on the board. The fact that both the anaphoric expressions and their antecedents refer to the same entities, they are co-referential, is a characteristic of many anaphora but not of deixis. This is not to say that there is no overlap with deixis. Readers will have noted that the form there is also used as a deictic expression. Indeed, in bis utterance, one could imagine a scenario in which there is used not only to refer back to on the board but to pick out deictically the particular board to be used. Expressions functioning anaphorically comprise most frequently third-person pronouns, and repeated or synonymous noun phrases could have repeated, but also, for example, other definite noun phrases, including pronouns demonstrative such as those, proper nouns, proforms, and adverbs. To this list, we might add the absence of an expression where it is expected, a gap in the syntax. A typical example is the absence of the second finite verb in coordinated structures, such as she took kindly to him and he took kindly to her. Nevertheless, to say, the resources available for expressing anaphoric reference vary from language to language. For example, some languages lack third-person pronouns, deploying full nominal expressions instead, whose sites erring. As one might guess, even typical anaphoric expressions are not always anaphoric and do not always refer, at least not straightforwardly. Consider these examples, all of which concern the third-person singular pronoun. Letter A. It's not looking good. Letter B. What time is it? Letter C. I think it's wonderful the strips are to be made in medicine. Letter D. Kill it, cook it, eat it. It in A has no textual antecedent. It is not anaphoric but most obviously a deictic usage. It points to the particular state of the sky. Holiday and Hassan 1976 and 1997 label uses that rely on something outside the text For their interpretation, exophoric, a category which contrasts with endophoric, which includes uses that rely on something inside the text. It, in B, is similar to A. It has no textual antecedent. However, although it also involves the extra-linguistic context and thus is exophoric, it is not picking out something specific in the situational context in which it is said, as would be the case with deixis. Instead, it is an empty or dummy subject referring to an aspect of the context of the utterance that can readily be inferred. Dummy subjects such as these are often used to refer to very general contextual aspects of utterance, notably relating to time, distance, or weather. Holiday and Hassan 1997 label such uses homophoric. It in C is similar to an anaphoric usage, but in this case it is referring forward to the textual segment that strips are to be made in medicine. The speaker presumably means the things that can be successfully striven. Such uses are termed cataphoric. Holiday and Hassan 1997. Finally, the point of interest regarding D is that each instance of it is co-referential, that is, each refers to the same entity, except that they do not quite. The animal that is killed is not identical to the animal that is cooked and is eventually eaten. But of course, the point of this title is to make it clear that we are anesthetized to the realities of eating meat by the fact that we only encounter it as prepared food in supermarkets. Reflection. Anaphoric and other referring expressions, their variation across English written registers. Biber et al. 1998 Module 5 explored the usage of referring expressions, particularly anaphoric expressions, across different registers using the corpus-based methodology for similar findings. More specifically, they examine referring expressions, noun phrases, and pronouns across two spoken register, conversation and public speeches, though we will not report the results of public speeches here from the London corpus, and two written registers, news, reportage, and academic prose from the Locke corpus. They found an uneven distribution of referring expressions. News reportage had the largest number, then conversation, and finally academic prose. To understand these differences better, Biber et al. Then looked at the distribution according to type of referring expression, retrieving frequencies across the registers for exophoric pronouns, anaphoric pronouns, and anaphoric nouns. They discovered that exophoric referring expressions made up over half of the referring expressions in conversation, whereas they were almost non-existent in the written registers, news, and academic prose. Those written registers were dominated by anaphoric nouns. In other words, people, not surprisingly, regularly refer to aspects of their immediate extra-linguistic context in conversation, whereas in the written registers, they refer to aspects of the previous text. They also look at the average distance between the referring expression and the antecedent in the various registers. The distance was defined as the number of intervening noun phrases. Some large differences emerge. The averages are conversation, academic prose, and news reportage. That referring expressions occur much closer to their antecedents in conversation can be partly explained by the fact that conversation is conducted online with all the mental processing pressures that implies. Referring expressions with short distances to their antecedents are easier to understand. But this finding is also a consequence of the referring expression type. Exophoric referring expressions do not have intervening textual material. They refer directly to their reference. Using and understanding referring expressions in interaction. Referring expressions and context. They're out there. This is the creative way to begin a novel. It creates psychological prominence. We have the outline of a puzzle here, but not the pieces with which to complete it. We know that some group of people, they are located in some space away from where the speaker writer is out there. The referring expressions begin to build the point of view of one particular character, the protagonist, who is incarcerated in a mental institution. It flags the kind of context that needs fleshing out. This helps achieve the dramatic purpose of the novelist. Let us look at another literary example. This is the first stanza of W. H. Auden's poem, Funeral Blues, Stop All the Clocks, 1937 and 1976. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. As we pointed out in section 2.2, definite nouns phrases presuppose the existence of their referents and can be used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific context which is assumed to be shared. Thus, the definite noun phrase in "the book you're reading is great" may be taken as identifying the book the speaker says you're reading, rather than say the one you read when you go to bed, because you both share, through physical co-presence, visual contact, that specific context. However, the definite noun phrases in the Auden poem are not like this. They presuppose the existence of clocks, telephone, dog, pianos, coffin, and mourners. But in doing this, they also construct the context in which the particular reference can be identified. They do not possibly rely on a specific shared context for interpretation. Rather, they construct a specific shared context in which they can be interpreted. These items construct a particular fictional world. More particularly, the items coffin and mourners in the final line trigger the contextual frame of schema of a funeral by virtue of the fact that they are stereotypical components of the contextual frame. Thus, they suggest the frame in which they can be identified as particular components as opposed to simply being identified as particular components within a given frame. It is not surprising that literary linguistic scholars have focused on how referring expressions in literature contribute to the creation of fictional worlds. In fact, it is normal in all kinds of interaction for people to rely on information from context to interpret referring expressions and also to use referring expressions to help construct the context in which they are interpreted. It is a two-way street. Note that this is a radical departure from the traditional approach to referring expressions, which focuses on the context fleshing out the referring expression and not the referring expression signaling the context of which it is a part. An excellent example of the latter, cited by Epstein 1999, appears in a newspaper. In this example, a sports commentary writer reflects on the city of Los Angeles' loss of two professional football teams who used to play there. So we lost the Rams and the Raiders. Lost our innocence, but hold the flowers, put away the handkerchiefs, stop the sobbing, we still have the Rose Bowl, haven't we? Like the poem above, and probably partly inspired by it, the definite noun phrases, the flowers, the handkerchiefs, and the sobbing refer to stereotypical components of the frame of the funeral. The funeral frame itself is not mentioned prior to the usage of these definite noun phrases. As Epstein 1999 comments, the frame itself need to be directly evoked at all, but can be activated simply by mentioning some of its salient elements. In section 2.2, we wrote that definite expressions are primarily used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific context which is assumed to be shared by the interlocutors. The use of primarily was judicious because the uses of referring expressions discussed in this section, creating psychological prominence, expressing viewpoint of triggering frames, do not feel well the idea of identifying particular reference from items in a given category. Epstein 1999 suggests that thinking in terms of accessibility is preferable, and we will expand on this notion in the following section. Referring expressions and accessibility. Prince 1981 and Ariel 1988 and 1990 proposed that different types of referring expressions are used by producers according to their assumptions about how accessible the referent is in the mind of the target. Ariel 1988 proposes an accessibility marking scale along which referring expressions are ranked according to degree of accessibility. Thus, at one end, producers use zeros, gulps, pronouns, and demonstrative pronouns for highly accessible reference, while at the other end, they use long definite expressions and full names to refer to less accessible reference. For example, in saying, "Have you got it with you?" the producer assumes that the referent of it is highly accessible to the target. One does not have to spell it out. In contrast, in saying, "Have you got your classic car with you?" the producer assumes that the referent is less accessible to the target, and so the fuller your classic car is required. The accessibility of reference is said to be determined by 4 factors: the saliency of the referent, the recency of a previous mention, the number of other referents competing for the role of antecedent, and the degree of cohesion between the units that the expression and its antecedent occur in. Gondel's 1993 giveness hierarchy ranks referring expressions along a scale according to the assumed cognitive status of the associated reference for the target. Cognitive status refers to the assumed attention state of the referent. However, unlike the accessibility marking scale, the thrust of the giveness hierarchy is that particular referring expressions provide information to the target addressee about where in memory the representation of the referent is expected to be found. For example, using the pronoun "it" to refer to a classic car signals to the target that they do not need to search wildly for the referent classic car, but it is in focus as in currently activated in short-term memory and center of attention. In contrast, a classic car signals merely that the target knows the category classic car described by the expression they can identify the type. Somewhere in between would be, for example, the expression "that classic car," which signals that the target is familiar with the referent. They not only know the category but are able to identify the specific intended referent because they have a representation of it in memory. Each type of referring expression is conventionally associated with a particular cognitive status. Any use of that expression signals a particular cognitive status which the target can then take account of in their search for an interpretation. The cognitive statuses discussed in the work of Gondel and colleagues are as follows. Figure 2.1. The cognitive statuses of referring expressions, solid blank arrows, can be taken to mean "and thus also." A key point to note about these cognitive statuses is that they are not mutually exclusive. The statuses are related such that a particular cognitive status entails lower statuses. For example, an item that is in focus is necessarily activated, familiar, uniquely identifiable, and so on. The importance of this scale, Gondel and colleagues argue, is that it is a basis for implicational meanings. via Greece's 1975 maxim of quantity, whereby using a form with a weaker status implicates that stronger status does not obtain. Thus, saying a classic car implicates that a stronger status does not obtain. Thus, saying a classic car implicates that the speaker believes that the addressee cannot uniquely identify the referent, whereas saying that classic car implicates, for instance, that the speaker believes that the referent is not in focus. Let us briefly illustrate some of these issues with the following joke. Voice on the phone. Hello? Is that the maternity hospital? Receptionist. Yes. Voice on the phone. Can you send an ambulance round? The wife is about to have a baby. Receptionist. Is this her first baby? Voice on the phone. No, this is her husband. At the heart of the joke are the differing understandings arising from the demonstrative this in the second utterance of the receptionist. Most likely for the receptionist, and indeed the reader, the referent of this has activated status, as the baby was mentioned in the immediately previous sentence, though it was not the topic, hence it was not in focus. In the receptionist's second utterance, her first baby is the topic, and thus it is brought into focus. According to the giveness hierarchy, we might have expected a husband to reply, no, it's not her first baby, or yes, it's her first baby. However, the husband constructs a radically different understanding, namely, this refers to the identity behind his voice. To sustain this, we must assume that he thinks that the receptionist thinks that this refers to the voice on the phone, and that the voice is that of her first baby. In this scenario, this merely has the status of being referential, that is, referring to a particular voice, but not one that is even uniquely identifiable. This, of course, is completely improbable, because their respective identities have in fact been established. They at least have the cognitive status of activated. The giveness hierarchy usefully throws light on how the choice of referring expression works. It is not, however, a complete account of referring expressions. It is based on the notion of givenness understood as assumptions about accessibility for the target. However, in section 2.5.1, we saw pronouns used in context where the reference accessibility was not the only issue. It was not simply a matter of where to access something in one's mind. Epstein, 1999, whose work is focused on the definite article the, was very aware of this and hence defined accessibility simply as being available for interpretation. 1999. He concludes from his analysis of real data that the article seems to be an instruction which prompts the addressee into making the appropriate conceptual constructions for interpreting the nominal in discourse. In other words, such prompts go beyond helping identify where in the mind to access a referent. A prompt can introduce new reference, and do so in such a way that facilitates interpretation of the discourse by, for example, creating psychological prominence, expressing a viewpoint, or triggering frames. Referring expressions and common ground. Again, recollect our statement that definite expressions are primarily used to invite the participants to identify a particular referent from a specific context which is assumed to be shared by interlocutors. The idea of assumed to be shared is crucial in pragmatics. Note, for example, that the baby joke 2.21 is difficult to explain without reference to the notion of common ground. For example, mutual or shared knowledge assumptions or beliefs. Specifically in the joke, the idea of making assumptions about people's assumptions arose. We must assume that he thinks that the receptionist thinks that this refers to the voice on the phone and that the voice is that of her first baby. Herbert Clark and his colleagues have made important contributions to the understanding of common ground. To illustrate the issues, consider that the first author of this book is a closet petrolhead. Most of his colleagues in the world of academia would not know a connecting rod from a crankshaft. Consequently, if a conversation shifts to cars, he makes the assumption that they do not both have this background knowledge. Conversely, it is more than likely, given that his interests are hidden, that they make the assumption that he also lacks knowledge in this area, and conversations are tailored accordingly. Note what is happening here. Assumptions are being made on both sides about what knowledge is common to both parties, that is, about common ground. Importantly, one makes assumptions about what assumptions are being made about what knowledge is in common. He assumes that his colleagues assume that they both know very little about cars. This is important because deciding what to say will, in part, depend on your assumptions about what you think the others think you both know. One could make further assumptions about those assumptions about the knowledge you have in common. And further levels could be added, of course. This infinite recursion of assumption is not the stop of psychological reality. People would become mentally exhausted. Psycholinguistic research is not very precise about how many levels of assumptions are deployed in communication. Some suggest we do not go beyond there. Others suggesting at most 6. There is, in fact, another way of affording insights into this phenomenon, and that is by inspecting interactions themselves. People can check the assumptions about common ground are correct or repair understandings that appear to be based on erroneousness assumptions about common ground. Recursion or reflexivity in pragmatics is a topic to which we will return in section 8.2. Common ground can be seen as a subset of background knowledge, the subset that is relevant to communication because it is believed to be in common amongst the participants involved. Note here that we are more accurately talking about background assumptions and beliefs which are held with varying degrees of certainty rather than knowledge. On what basis might we suppose something to be common ground? One such basis concerns sociocultural knowledge. We assume common information about the practices and conventions of our cultures and communities, physical and natural laws, and experiences involving others. Another basis concerns personal experiences with other people. We assume common information about whether others are co-present at an event or not, the kind of relations amongst us, particular events, and particular discourses. The fact that common ground involves, amongst other things, shared knowledge of particular discourses is important in a number of respects. Everything that is said in a discourse potentially constitutes part of the common ground for those participants party to the discourse, along with the other happenings that accompany that conversation, like the actions of participants, visual appearances, sounds. Discourse, of course, is dynamic, and if it is amongst other experiences, feeding common ground, then common ground is dynamic too. Another issue to which we will return in the following section as well as in section 3.4.2. People tailor their referring expressions according to assumptions about common ground. A definite noun, phrase, a deictic expression, or an anaphoric expression invites an interlocutor to interpret something in a particular way, often to pick out a particular referent in common ground. Whether or not your interlocutor will be able to do this is a calculated gamble based primarily on one's understanding of the common ground that pertains. If you say, "Can you repeat that please?" you assume that your interlocutor will understand what your deictic that is referring to. Or if you say, "Can you pass me that?" you assume that your interlocutor can understand that your deictic that is referring to the pepper mill she has just been using in front of you. Reflection. Recognitional deixis or thingamy. A specific phenomenon that it is strongly dependent on common ground concerns nominal expressions such as thingamy, thingamajig, washer, what's it, what's his name, what you'd call it, and you know what? Such expressions, unlike the definite noun phrases discussed earlier, provide a little descriptive information to help one work out what is being talked about. Yet, in the shared context of a dinner, an expression such as thingamy is likely to be taken as a reference to the pepper mill on the table, and was equally likely to have been used in the expectation that this reference would be assigned. Recognitional deixis is a label coined by Enfield 2003 for such items. It acknowledges that they behave like deictic expressions, picking out items relative to the speakers here and now, but also that they rely heavily on common ground to be successfully recognized. Why might we use such words? Consider these examples of recent usage of thingamy taken from the Oxford English Corpus. Society anyway, back to the point, Mandela has little to do with this US versus Iraq thingamy, and it means that he can speak out in a way that many others get, but he's terribly involved in the whole Zimbabwe thingamy, and it means that he can't speak about that. Weblog, I partook of the lamshank and Ma had the beef thingamy. Weblog, this is because some sort of technical thingamy happened with our hosting thingamy. Although you do not have access to the full context, it is quite to see that they are often used in contexts where specialized lexis would be required, or where there may be difficulty in identifying an appropriate word, or where there are restrictions on the obvious term. In context, it is highly likely that this will present few difficulties because the participants have a common ground. Additionally, it is not the case that such expressions present participants with no descriptive information at all. In fact, they offer constraints on interpretations. This point is spelled out by Enfield 2003. He suggests, for example, that the speaker's message in using "what's his name" could be defined as someone. I can't say this person's name now. By saying "what's his name," I think you'll know who I'm thinking of. This contrasts with, for example, "you know what," which may have both avoidance and conspiratorial functions, whereby a speaker deliberately avoids saying a certain word either to prevent potentially overhearing third parties from understanding, and or to create exclusive air between interlocutors. Referring expressions in interaction. Thus far in section 2.5, we have raised a number of issues that are key to interaction, including the idea that 1. Referring expressions are not simply enriched by context but can also help construct it. 2. The choice of referring expression is influenced by the speaker's assumptions about the degree to which the referent is in the target's mind. And third, the choice of referring expression is influenced by assumption about the common ground that pertains between specific interlocutors. All these go beyond our initial idea of inviting a participant to pick some particular referent out of a specific context. This section briefly explores two further notions at the heart of interaction. One is that the process of choosing and enriching referring expressions is dynamic, and the other is that the process is emergent. As we noted in the previous section, shared discourse plays a role in feeding common ground. Here we see the participants using the scores to establish common ground. Example 2.23 illustrates how what is being referred to, the referent, emerges in the interaction, and how the two interlocutors collaborate in working it out. Clearly, Ivy wants to specify where the referent of she is going to live, but is having difficulty. Note the incomplete definite noun phrase next door to the. Together, they work it out through a spatial basis. Mapping out the location through questions and answers. The eureka moment comes with PS22J's hugely descriptive definite noun phrase. The big red brick one next door to doctor's surgery, assisting Ivy in identifying the location. And when Ivy confirms the referent of this noun phrase, PS22J switches to anaphoric it. A key scholar to have explored conversational interaction and referring expressions, specifically anaphora, is Barbara Fox. Argues that there is a continuous interaction amongst the following three steps of reasoning. First, anaphoric form X is the unmarked form for the context like the one the participant is in now. Second, by using anaphoric form X, then the participant displays a belief that the context is of a particular sort. Third, if the participant displays the belief that the context is of a particular sort, then the other parties may change their beliefs about the nature of the context to be in accord with the belief displayed. Just as we have been discussing above, for Fox, anaphoric choice at once is determined by and itself determines the structure of the talk. Also, note that change is built in. As beliefs about context change, then what counts as unmarked changes for the selection of the next form. What this means then is that the usage of referring expressions and what counts as their reference in context is not only a two-way street, but a street whose direction is constantly shifting as it is mapped out by its traffic, or, to put it another way, the meanings or referring expressions emerge in a dynamic fashion as the interaction progresses. Fox 1987, 18-19 suggests that the basic pattern in non-story conversation is the first mentions of a referent in a sequence are done with a full noun phrase, and thereafter a pronoun is used to display an understanding that the sequence is not closed. However, what counts as a sequence varies from genre to genre. As we have seen in the reflection box on variation across English written registers, the usage of referring expressions varies hugely across genres, so what will count as unmarked will vary. Moreover, note that this is a basic pattern. Participants can exploit it. One context in which this can happen is disagreement. Note the final line of this example from Fox data. Here, the use of a proper noun Alex instead of the pronominal he is geared towards attracting the attention of the first speaker to the fact that her or his assumption about Alex are incorrect. Moreover, Downing 1996, 136 observes that proper nouns can be usefully deployed in contexts where the speaker wishes to display his or her authority to speak about a particular referent, as is common in disagreement contexts, and this fits here. Reflection. The use of mate in interactions amongst Australian speakers of English. We earlier mentioned in passing that familiarizers such as mate are often used in British English as a means of signaling solidarity amongst males. However, recent work by Rendell Short 2009 indicates that amongst Australian speakers of English, at least younger females are now also using the term mate as an address term. rather than being seen as a term used primarily by men to show equality or egalitarianism. It is perceived as a friendly and fun term used to show intimacy. This indicates that the use and perception of socially dictic expressions can change over time, or at least they can change across generations of speakers of English. Randall Short 2010 also illustrate in a follow-up study how the sequential placement of mate contributes to the understanding of participants about its function and implications in a particular context. It was found in her study that mate very often occurs after the assessment, agreement, acknowledgement, or appreciation. In the following interaction, for instance, a father congratulates his son, a positive assessment followed by the address term mate. The son's appreciation in the following turn is also followed by mate. In such post-positioned contexts, it is used to signal open friendliness. However, in rejecting the acknowledgement, the father subsequently uses mate in the middle of his turn rather than it being post-positioned. In this case, the use of mate mitigates the force of this disagreement. We can see, then, that the sequential positioning of a referring expression can contribute, at least in part, to the interpretation of its particular function. We will return to consider the issue of sequentiality and speech acts in Module 6. Conclusion. While it is clear that no referring expression is devoid of semantic meaning, he has the sense of something singular and usually male, the pro-form do of some kind of action, etc. Definite expressions, deictic expressions, and anaphoric expressions depend in large part for their full meaning on both the hearer working out the relevant reference, the speaker choosing referring expressions to nudge the target's understanding in the relevant direction, and both the speaker and the hearer collaborating in these processes. This is why they are both a semantic and a pragmatic phenomenon. We should also remember that referring expression forms do not always refer it. The second word of this paragraph, for example, is not referring. We need to work out when they do and when they do not. The converse is also the case. Sometimes, non-referring expressions refer. Our final section 2.5 focus on the uses and understanding of referring expressions in interaction. We pointed out that referring expressions are not simply empty slots filled with contextual information. Those referring expressions can, and often do, trigger the relevant contextual information with which they are filled. They can be used for a range of functions, including the expressions of psychological prominence or a particular viewpoint. We discuss how speakers select particular referring expressions according to their assumptions about the degree to which the referent is in the target's mind's eyes. In turn, hearers interpret those referring expressions in part by taking into consideration what is implied by the speaker's particular selection. We also introduced common ground and its role in influencing the selection of referring expressions and retrieval of reference. Finally, we focused on the dynamic and emergent characteristics of referring in interaction, including the exploitation of referring expressions. For example, by choosing less obvious referring expressions to signal a particular interpersonal meaning, such as relative power. As far as English is concerned, we have shown how, especially in our reflection boxes, some features that are common to many Englishes, such as the definite article, do not appear in other languages, and even within English may have been different in the past. We have not only touched on contrasts with other languages, but also variation amongst Englishes and within a particular English. We also considered variation within speech and in writing. Apart from the obvious conclusion that discussions of workings of referring expressions cannot be based on data sets consisting just of English referring expressions, we should note that the way in which those expressions vary as a particular source of interest in its own right, whether it is accounting for changes from demonstratives to definite articles in terms of grammaticalization, differences amongst written genres, or the role that referring expressions undertake in crewing their own interpretive frames. In fact, to fully understand the phenomena constituted by referring expression, we need to understand dot variation.